thanks for watching today. Let's get a little additional insight into this week's Sunday school lesson. Remember, we are in this unit that's entitled Second Nature. We're in the second week. It's called Solomon, Unfailing Wisdom. We'll be looking in 1 Kings chapter 3, verses 3 through 14, and chapter 4, verses 20 through 34. And the point of the lesson is that Christ-centered living chooses wisdom from God, not simply knowledge. You may have noticed that the point of the lesson this week is very similar to the point of the lesson last week. In fact, all 7 lessons in this unit have a very similar format when it comes to the point of the lesson, and that is that Christ-centered living chooses something, not something else. So that's something you might want to bring out each week and collectively review the previous points of the lesson, and it just kind of ties in together the whole unit overarching theme. Also, you may have noticed that the biblical text for this week's Sunday school lesson is quite a bit longer than usual. And again, just like last week in this text, there are more of those Old Testament names. And so here's an idea for you. I know one of our Sunday school teachers here in church does this, and you may want to do something similar. You might bring in your smartphone or your tablet or your laptop and connect an external speaker. It could be a Bluetooth speaker or just another speaker with a 3.5 millimeter headphone jack attached to it, and let a Bible app or Bible program read the text for you. So that's one way of getting around reading those Old Testament names, is having the program, the app, read it for you. And it's different. Okay, you may or may not want to do that every week, but it's always good to do something a little bit different in your class, and kind of sparks interest instead of having the same old routine and doing the same old thing week after week. All right, now so when you start off with, you might ask a question like, who's the wisest person that you know? And what was it that made you characterize that person as wise? You also might jokingly ask, what's the difference between a wise person and a wise guy? There's a big difference there, isn't there? Now this week we're looking at Solomon, and of course he is known for his wisdom. And just to do a little bit of background on him, of course he is King David's son. He assumed the throne after David's death. So how old was Solomon when he became king? We really don't know. You have some scholars that say he was probably about age 12. But when you compare that with some of the other biblical texts about how old he was when he died and how old his son was when Solomon's son took over as king, you'd see that he had to be early teens when he fathered a son, and that's probably not likely. It's probably that he was around age 20. Now, in our text this week, Solomon, as he's talking to God, says, "I am just a child." Now, that's a phrase that could apply from anyone from toddler age up until around marrying age. So based on that and other passages as well, we conclude he was probably around age 20 when he assumed the throne. Now here's another question. How do we define wisdom? What is wisdom? If you had to narrow that down to one word, that's pretty difficult. I might say discernment. That might equate with wisdom in one word. A better question might be, what's the difference between intelligence and wisdom? Well, to me, it's knowledge versus application. It's facts versus understanding. You've probably heard it said that about a particular person that he or she can be as smart as a whip, smart as can be, but they just don't have any common sense, because intelligence does not equal wisdom. Now, Buckminster Fuller in 1982 came up with something called the knowledge doubling curve, and in it he determined that until about 1900, human knowledge doubled about every century. And then by the end of World War II, it doubled about every 25 years. And then in 2013, a researcher by the name of David Schilling wrote that human knowledge is now doubling every 13 months and will eventually double every 12 hours. So the growth of knowledge is not our problem, but what we do with that knowledge once we gain it, that's where the concern comes into play. Now we see in our text that Solomon went to one of the high places to sacrifice to God. And those high places are those areas, those temples, those places where the Canaanites would sacrifice to their gods. And Yahweh God instructed Israel when they came in and took over the land to tear down those high places. And because if they didn't, they would be tempted to incorporate that into their worship and eventually be tempted to worship other gods. But Israel did not do that. You see, one of the first steps in sliding down that slippery slope to idol worship is to compromise and to use the forbidden for good. And that's what they were doing here. They were using those pagan temples or pagan places of worship and sacrifice and using those to worship God because they hadn't built a house of worship yet, a temple. They had not built that yet. We can look back in 2 Samuel 7 and 1 Chronicles 28 and see that King David, Solomon's father, wanted to build a house for the Lord, wanted to build a temple. And God said, no, you're a man of bloodshed, you're a man of war, but your son will do this. So that's why there's no temple yet until King Solomon comes along. So Solomon offered sacrifices to God in those pagan places. Now, I don't want to make Solomon out to be some super holy example for everybody to follow. He definitely had his flaws. He had his good points, but he also had his flaws as well. One being that he had a divided heart when it came to God. But here's the good thing. God used him and blessed him despite his weakness, just like his father David. David was what? He was a murderer. He was an adulterer, but he's also called a man after God's own heart. And so that should be an encouragement for us as well. Now, here are a few indications that Solomon did have a divided heart when it came to his relationship with God. One, he spiritually compromised on many things, including he intermarried with foreigners. That was something that was strictly prohibited. And we see that in just in this same chapter up in verse 1 where he married one of the daughters of the pharaohs of Egypt. This also led him into idolatry, just like God warned. If you intermarry with foreigners who bring their foreign gods, you're going to be tempted and you will fall down this slippery slope of starting to worship other gods. We see this in 1 Kings chapter 11, verses 1 through 8. This is the route that Solomon took. Solomon also didn't tear down the high places. In fact, the Bible itself tells us that Solomon's heart was divided when it came to his relationship with God. Let me read to you 1 Kings chapter 11, verse 4. It says, as Solomon grew old, his wives turned his heart after other gods, and his heart was not fully devoted to the Lord his God, as the heart of David, his father, had been. So there you have it right out of the Bible, that Solomon had a divided loyalty, a divided heart when it came to God. So we see in our text that Solomon is worshiping. He's offering sacrifices to Yahweh, to the Lord, at these high places that the Canaanites had built. And during this time, God tells him, ask what I should give you. And Solomon basically answers with, give me wisdom. Now, he didn't ask for spiritual wisdom, but actually he asked for kind of a political wisdom, a wisdom to judge rightly between people. And God not only gave him this wish, but he also gave him some other things that went along with it. He allowed him to be wealthy along with the wisdom and to have power. Now, you might say, wait a minute, wait. That's not fair. Solomon is a man with divided loyalty, a divided heart. It's not fair that God would bless him with this much stuff. And you're right. And here's the fact that I think is right. God is not fair. And what do I mean by that? I mean, if he were fair, he would give everyone exactly what they deserve. And just as he is gracious to us by giving us more than what we deserve, he was also gracious to Solomon as well. So we shouldn't sit in too much judgment of Solomon and be too critical of God's blessing on him. Now, here are some examples, I think, as we look at Solomon's life that we should follow. One of the examples we can follow from Solomon's life is that he asked for wisdom and not stuff. Let's think back to when we were young children. Christmas time rolled around, or birthday rolled around, and you were asked, what do you want? You had no problem with coming up with that list of stuff, the new toys, the new this, that, all these things that you wanted. Now, as we got older, as we matured, probably most of us, especially when you get to my age, you're asked, what do you want for Christmas? What do you want for your birthday? And it's like, I'm satisfied. I just want to be with family. And so as we mature in Christ, we realize as we come to Him in prayer, we ask less for stuff and concentrate more on our relationship with Him. Also, we can look at Solomon's humility, at least what he had there at this time here in our text, at the beginning of his reign. We see that at this time Solomon knew his limits. He was young. He was young as a king. He knew his inexperience in leading. And so there again, as we mature, I think we realize that the more we know, actually the less we know. So how do we obtain wisdom? What does the Bible say? Well, we can see in Proverbs chapter 1, verse 7, as well as chapter 9, verse 10, what's the beginning of wisdom? The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. And of course, that fear is the respect or awe that we have for God. That's the beginning of wisdom. James 1:5, what does it say? It says, if any of you lacks wisdom, you should ask God, who gives generously to all without fault, and it will be given to you. Ask for wisdom. Also, we can look in Proverbs chapter 11, verse 2, and it says, when pride comes, then comes disgrace, but with humility comes wisdom. So humility is another part of obtaining wisdom. We get down to the last part of our lesson text for the week, chapter 4, verses 29 through 34, and we see that Solomon was a vast writer. In fact, most of what we call wisdom literature in the Old Testament was written by Solomon. We can see Psalm 72 as well as Psalm 127 was written by him. Most of Proverbs, Ecclesiastes is attributed to him, as well as, of course, the Song of Solomon, or the Song of Songs. We can also see in this text and in chapter 4 that he knew a lot about stuff, about nature, from trees to animals. He knew. People sought him out for his wisdom. In fact, he was, I guess you could call him the Renaissance man of his day, an earlier version of Thomas Jefferson. But like Thomas Jefferson, he had his faults as well. We've talked about those. So here's some takeaways I think we can grab from this week's lesson, is that wisdom comes from God, but wisdom does not guarantee righteousness. And we can see that in the life of Solomon. Similarly, the smartest, wisest person is still susceptible to giving in to temptation. Also, that education does not guarantee wisdom. In fact, I've known some people who have had a very limited education that are pretty wise. And you probably have known some very smart people, like we've mentioned earlier, who don't have that common sense at all. Also similar to that, kind of what we've already mentioned, is that a lot of information in our head does not equate to wisdom. We have so much information available to us today. In fact, maybe too much. We're just overwhelmed by it. Let me encourage you as you teach your Sunday school class to not just teach to transmit information, but teach for application, teach to transform. And so by doing that, you're actually putting this lesson into practice by not just teaching for information, not just teaching for facts or knowledge, but teaching for them to be wise. You're helping your class to be wise by teaching them how to apply the lesson. Now, next week, we're going to be looking at Ruth, and commitment will be the topic for next week. I want to thank you for watching, and remember the advice given by Solomon in Proverbs chapter 3, verse 7, where he says, do not be wise in your own eyes. Fear the Lord and shun evil. Have a great Sunday school class.